So my talk is how to engage with browser vendors, and basically, so what I'm going to do with this talk is I'm going to assume that you are someone who is excited about the web and wants to push the web forward and wants to influence how browsers ship web features and how the web platform is built. And this is going to come from a guy who just joined a browser vendor, so this is the kind of stuff that I wish someone had told me like a year ago, like, the tips and tricks to like get a browser vendor's attention. So, okay, first off, file bugs. Please, please file bugs. I cannot tell you how often, like, a bug in a browser gets fixed, independently 10 times in 10 different jQuery plugins, through some workaround, and they put some comment that says, Safari 9 point whatever is awful, and then they just don't file a bug on the browser. So the browser doesn't find out there's a bug. And if a bug had been filed on the browser, maybe they could have just, gone in and changed 3 lines of C++ code and it would have been fixed. But instead, like, this workaround has to be reinvented over and over again in the community. Which is really suboptimal. When you file bugs on a browser, like, it's like any project. Like a browser is just like any other software project. Like when we look at a bug, we have to try to figure out, is this understandable? Like, are there steps to reproduce? What's the impact? Like, how do we prioritize this thing? So when you file a bug, just like any software project, make sure you have good steps to reproduce. Make sure you have a nice, small, minimal repro. Like, the juiciest thing in a bug is when there's a live test case, and it's a minimal test case, just like a small HTML file that reproduces what's going on. Ideally, like, you use something like, just use GitHub gist and just like put an index.html file in there. And then you can use something like blocks.org, which is really awesome, where it just like hosts those HTML files for you. Those things are really, really useful to browser vendors. And then also, like, explain the impact, like explain how this bug is affecting you when you're writing your app. Don't just like say, here's a bug, because we actually have trolls. Like, we actually have people who will just like go and hunt down like the most esoteric edge case in SVG ever and file a bug about it just to like bug us. And then, like, we have no idea what the impact is. So, that goes in the bottom of the pile. So explain the impact. And then when you want to influence browsers to adopt some kind of feature that you really, really love, like say, a feature ships in Chrome and Firefox, and like say Edge and Safari are kind of sitting on the sidelines trying to figure out, like, okay, should we implement this now? Should we implement it later? Like, what's the priority? The way I like to think about this is that everyone has their API that they love, right? Like, everyone has their API that they think is the most important API in the world, and if I just had this API in all the browsers, like, my web apps would be awesome. And the problem is that everyone has a different API. So, like, from my perspective as a browser vendor, it's like people come up to me and say, hey, we really need Edge to implement the FlimFlam API. Like, the FlimFlam API is vital to the future of the web, and it's absolutely necessary. And, like, then 20 more people come up and say they want the FlimFlazzle API, right? So, like, we have to prioritize these things. We have to figure out, which ones are going to give us the biggest bang for our buck. So the best thing you can do is to just use the APIs, like, use progressive enhancement. Like, service workers are a great example of something that you can use today that, like, it gracefully degrades in browsers that don't support it, and it gives a great motivation to browsers that have not yet implemented it to start implementing it. Because in websites that use service workers as a progressive enhancement that fall back to the network case, right? It's a really great offline experience in the browsers that have implemented service worker, and the ones that haven't, it's not such a great experience. So that's a clear value add for the browser, right? We look out on the web and say, hey, there's all these sites that work great in other browsers. Why doesn't it work as well in our browser? Well, we should implement this thing to fix that. If it doesn't get used, it might not get implemented. And we do actually look at usage statistics to figure out whether we should implement something or not. Don't just like rant on Reddit or on Hacker News. Like, you can do that, that's cool, but then go into the bug or go into like whatever issue is open on a browser and like go in there and like vote it up. Like, every browser vendor has this thing where there's like either a bug tracker or like on Edge we have this thing called user voice where you can go in and you can vote things up and then go in there and like you can link back to the thread. Like, you can say, look, people are angry about this. Look at this Reddit rant. And like, we do look at that, but you have to like let us know it exists. Otherwise, like, we're not trawling Hacker News and Reddit every single day, right? And then last of all, if you really want to get active, interact with the specs. So almost every single spec now for the W3C and the Wet Working Group are on GitHub. And like, the W3C is trying to encourage collaboration by going to GitHub where web developers are, right? But oftentimes, like, these repos are just kind of like barren of comments from anyone except browser vendors. So it's really sad, because like, we'll get together at our yearly meetings and we'll sit down and we'll look at the GitHub repo for service workers, say, and there's like no comments from anyone who's actually using service workers. And when there is, it's like we get so excited. Like, I remember at the last TPAC, like, we spent like a half an hour talking about some random issue that someone had opened on service workers. And like, that's really, really valuable feedback, because otherwise it's just browser vendors talking in an echo chamber. So go to these GitHub repos and actually interact with people. And yes, so how much time do I have left?
It's okay.
So yeah, browser vendors are kind of a weird job. Right? We have to build these things that are fundamentally interoperable, which means they're fundamentally kind of commodities, and we also need to, compete with each other in order to try to gain market share. So it's kind of a weird job that we have. Also, there's a lot more web developers out there in the world than there are browser vendors. Like, there are probably more people working on Facebook than there are working on all browsers combined. I'm pretty sure that's not an exaggeration. So please give us a little bit of help. File bugs, interact with us. Thank you.